assumed NHS capacity, and those Nightingale hospitals was an example that you could do that and you can do that. I think where Britain has fallen down compared to some other countries like Germany, we have to look at, obviously there'll be questions about the government and how quickly it went into the lockdown and so on. But I think we actually have to look at the structure of our NHS. I think it is a very, very centralized bureaucracy. Other countries have a much more regional approach to it.
My question was about whether, on your watch, each of you, could you have done more to build resilience in our NHS and care system? Because I think, as Alistair and others you've already mentioned, we need to look at what we do going forward and what we can learn, and what our current Treasury can do, building on what your achievements have been.
Well, I think the NHS
needs to be improved.
Yeah, well, the NHS is too centralised. I think when we do the inquiries into what happened on testing and PPE, it will not be just because some health minister didn't put a call into some company in China to get some PPE. It's because, we were too slow in the procurement, too centralised. And I think we should take a leaf out of what has happened in Manchester, where it's the one part of England where the NHS is devolved. And it, of all the agencies I came across in government, it is the most centralised, and by the way, the most difficult to penetrate for the elected government of the day. And then on care homes, look, none of us solved the care home crisis for a very simple reason. There are two ways to pay for better care in our country. You can either take the assets that people have, i.e. their home, get them to sell their home and pay for care. That is very politically painful to do, and let me finish. Or you can increase general taxation and provide a national care service, which would be very expensive to do, maybe the right solution, but then you go and make your argument for another couple of pence on income tax to pay for it. And those are the two options.
I'm gonna get on to Philip, because I've got a couple of more questions, and Chair's gonna shut me down soon.
So the problem about resilience is it's easy to say after an event, we should have had more resilience against this event. We're all talking about ventilators. Did we have enough ventilators? But if it had been a different type of virus, it wouldn't have been ventilators we needed, it would have been something else. Yeah. So it's not just about budgets, it's about the way in which you manage resilience. We have a national risk register which lists literally hundreds of risks that the country is facing and is regularly reviewed to try to ensure that we have a proper approach to resilience. But there is a balance. We would equally be mocked, and governments regularly are mocked, when they stockpile large amount of stuff which never gets used, gets to the end of its life and has to be destroyed. So we clearly didn't get it right in relation to resilience around PPE and ventilators. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I've no doubt at all that the process in the Cabinet Office of looking at how we manage resilience will be reviewed afterwards. I just want to say something about NHS budget. We put a very large amount of additional money into the NHS in 2018, and of course there were plenty of people around saying thank you very much, but we need much more. There is a capacity in the NHS, and you can expand it, but you need to expand it with care, because if you just pour money into the top of a system like the NHS, you risk creating sector-specific inflation where you don't get more healthcare, you just get better, more profitable drug companies. And I don't think that's what we want to do. We want to expand the system carefully and methodically.
Some would argue it should have been done over the decade, not towards the end after considerable pressure. I just wanted to get on to the point about exit strategy. Others have touched on it. You've all highlighted the fact that the interdependence between health and getting the economy kick-started. What do you think, building on what you've already said, what else do we need to do, does our Treasury and other bits of government need to do in terms of organising itself so that the exit strategy doesn't, in effect, mean a trade-off here in the UK? And then given the international nature of this pandemic, but also markets, what can we learn from both the financial crisis and the infrastructure that was set up and the global cooperation that existed? Many would argue that's missing at the moment, and global leadership is lacking. And this pandemic and this crisis needs it more than ever before. Can you reflect on some of those issues and concerns very quickly please. Got one more after that.
You're asking me to carry on?
Yeah, please, quickly. I'm just going to get it.
Okay. I mean, look, business needs guidance from the government about how we reactivate the economy. What are the assumptions we have to make? Are we living with COVID? Do we have to rebuild our infrastructure around a 2-meter separation distance? Is that really sustainable? Is there really a scientific base for 2 meters? For example, redesigning office space around a standard of 1 meter or 1.5 meters would be a radically different proposition from redesigning it around 2 meters. Now, I don't have access to the scientific advice, so I don't know whether we've really tested whether we can make that more user-friendly without unacceptably compromising the health position.
Alistair, just on the picking up on the international side, any reflections on that? You're muted.
Sorry, you're muted, Alistair, I think.
So the international cooperation that we had in 2009 was absolutely essential to get the global economy working again, and especially for a country like ours, which is a trading country. The fact that you had communist China and Republican-led United States and other countries in the G20 all meeting in Washington at that time, and in London, of course, in 2009, it made a massive difference. And unfortunately, at the moment, well, as you know, the two biggest economies, are barely speaking to each other at the moment, and the prospect of the G20, which happens to exist, it's not perfect, but it happens to exist. It's not able to function at the moment. So yes, it is important. And equally, if you're dealing with something like a pandemic, by very nature, it doesn't stop at political boundaries. And the cooperation we need, if only there'd been more cooperation when this thing first started, and perhaps we'd have started our lockdown a lot earlier. We will certainly need to work together to look at what we might do in the future, because the chances are the next pandemic will be different. So that but the cooperation is absolutely critical.
George, you've touched on a number of social consequences of earlier on. You mentioned social consequences. We see what's happening in the US. We see the inequalities in our own country and the effects on poorer people, frontline workers, Black and Asian people, and the differential death rates. In terms of our exit strategy, do you think we should be investing more in those groups who need to be employed so that we don't have these radical imbalances that are exacerbated on top of what they faced over the last decade? For instance, young people, 1 million young people are likely to be unemployed. Should there be a job guarantee, some sort of intermediate labor market, as was introduced during the financial crisis, to help young people? Because the risk is civil unrest if we don't make sure we give hope to those who are likely to face unemployment.
I'm sorry to interject. George, can you give a very short answer to this? I'm just aware of the number of people still to come in. Thank you. And then we'll move on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, sorry. I certainly think we should have a very comprehensive job program. I mean, all I would say is, I think in this country and elsewhere, there's going to be an ongoing battle, which this crisis has accentuated, not removed, between those who want, essentially a more progressive approach with government getting involved and helping people, and a big role for private sector, and those who want to kind of close borders and whatever. And this crisis has given both fuel for their causes.
Thank you. Angela, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I just wanted to ask this one initially to Alistair. Demand is going to stagnate if there isn't a global recovery. And in fact, COVID-19 is echoing around the world at different levels and may persist in places and keep coming back. Therefore, it will have a huge effect on global trade. In fact, I think it's the IMF is predicting a -3% fall in global GDP, which is unheard of in our lifetimes. So what do you think we should be doing? You began to answer this, but how can we use the international institutions to try to pull a global response together?
But on that, I think that's difficult, because if America and China aren't there, the two largest economies, you're always going to make pretty limited progress. I would look at it in a slightly different way, Angela. I think the key thing that we need to concentrate on at the moment on is what do we need to do to open up our economy? And it seems to me the key for that is to get a testing system that actually works. Now, we're a long way off that just now. The only people being tested are people who report in thinking they might have had COVID. Most of us don't know whether we've had it or not, because a lot of it's, the symptoms just aren't there. But if people in this country had the confidence they could go out and do all the things that we want to be doing, that would be great. But it would also internationally, it would help people say, yeah, the UK is okay to go to. And we've got this debate just now, about quarantining people coming off airplanes, which might have been a great idea 3 months ago, but I'm not convinced at the moment. But that it's, both of us have been in government, and you will know that governments are actually, they find it difficult to concentrate on more than 2 or 3 big things at one time. And if I was, not number 11, but number 10, I would concentrate on everything I'm doing at the moment to make sure that we do actually have a testing system that can be up there with the best of them. At the moment, we're not there. But I think if we did, that's where we should be putting our effort in at the moment. Obviously, we can contribute to and continue to call for international cooperation, and who knows? Countries may see eventually that actually we all live on the same planet. We do need to cooperate with each other. But I fear that at the moment, as George was alluding to just now, that those who would take a more protectionist approach are in the ascendancy. And I think
you're cheering me up, Alistair. I mean, I wonder whether you also think that countries like Germany did so much better also because they had their own quite large manufacturing base. So they could, the PPE issue, they can generate and manufacture machines, and our manufacturing sector is too small to respond. So, for example, although we manufacture vaccines in the UK, we don't have companies that we own that we can direct. We don't have a manufacturing base to deal with some of the deglobalization that might be happening as a result of protectionism. Is there something we should be doing to make ourselves more resilient as a country in the build back of that strategic nature?
3 quick points. This is an argument that's been going on since the end of the Second World War, when arguably we were very lackadaisical about the fact that we needed to rebuild our industries, whereas countries like Germany and Japan obviously had to do it, and they did it very well. The other thing, of course, that's been happening is that our economy has been predicated on us having access to markets to both import and export to throughout the world, which is why we took a relaxed view about the fact that stuff that we were building here was either, we needed here, was either being made on the other side of the world, or its component parts were there. That's the world in which we live. I think we are going to have to look at some of our resilience and our ability to do things, but I think you would never get to a situation, actually I'm not sure you'd want to get to a situation where we said, look, we're going to build and make just about everything we need in our country, and we're not going to have to go and engage with anybody else, because if everybody takes that attitude, the world will be the poorer for it. And as you well know, there's lots of literature on all that. So I don't
think I was advertising autarky. I think there's a little bit more balance.
Yeah, I understand the point you're making, which is why I said right at the outset, I don't think we should be indifferent to what our economic infrastructure looks like at the end of this. And I do think we should be careful about the fact that you can't always rely on being able to get essential things at times like this. And right. So I agree with you that, but I just was cautioning against. I know you wouldn't do this, but the people who believe that we can shut ourselves off from the rest of the world or our big markets. So that's perhaps going into another argument.
Yes, I agree. Now, George Osborne, you earlier said let's waste a crisis. Are there opportunities that you think, given the amount of interrelationship now between companies and the Treasury of a quite unexpected proportion, that the government could do strategically to put us in a better place to face the future? In other words, do we need to rebalance and ensure we devolve decision making to the regions? Can we come up with a concept of inclusive growth that makes us a more robust and resilient country and a fairer country going forwards?
Yeah, I think look, there was a debate before this crisis about the responsibility that companies had beyond that to the sort of bottom line and their shareholders, and it was sort of summarized as ESG, wasn't it? And I think there was a big debate, which, by the way, we need to get back to as a world about the environment. I think the sort of S and the G was a bit less kind of well defined, and if anything, the tragic death of George Floyd and all that has reminded people that actually companies also have obligations towards inclusion in their communities and so on. So I think this will turbocharge all of that was already in train. And when it comes to rebalancing, although I'm not sure there's so much a sort of private sector will follow where the government leads. And I do think and I came to this sort of late when I was in government. In the last couple of years I was Chancellor, but the sort of desire to run everything, by the way, particularly in the Treasury, but more broadly in the government, is a mistake. And we need to understand that what I think, coming back to the theme, one of the reasons why Germany may have done better is that in all sorts of ways it's a more regional system, including in its healthcare system. And we could take a big bet here on our regions being better at running things, elected mayors, transport authorities, economic decision making, planning control. All those things can be, we could take a really big step forward. And by the way, not do the reverse, which is, I see it here in London. We can get into an argument about why Transport for London needed to be bailed out, and but I'm not sure the answer is for the government to start running London transport policy again.
And Philip Hammond, do you think that there's an opportunity in not wasting a crisis, which if we don't respond quickly and we're not lucky might not be a recession, it might actually be a depression? Do you think that we ought to try to see if we can guide investment so that we make it more environmentally sustainable, for example, so that we help to reach our carbon neutral targets, so that we guide companies to the areas that we want them to try to innovate? I suppose very much like the Mariana Mazzucato approach to things, where you can try to get the right kind of incentives for innovation and build back better, I think the phrase is.
Well, firstly, I think investment is already heading in a greener direction for all sorts of reasons, and a major one is actually pressure by investors themselves. Companies are finding that the people who are investing in them are increasingly interested in the company's investment strategies to ensure that they align with their own. And of course, we should be encouraging investment in innovation, but there's a very big gap between creating an environment which is conducive to investment in innovation and the government telling people what they should innovate in. And I'm not at all convinced that UK governments of any colour would be very good at that. So it's about creating the environment for investment, using this crisis to remind ourselves again of the relentless need to focus on productivity improvement, because that is the way to improve living standards, competitiveness, and our economic growth. And as you rightly said at the beginning, the UK is probably more vulnerable than any other large economy to the trends in global trade. And the situation there looks rather depressing at the moment. There were headwinds to global trade as we went into this crisis. I think there are real risks that the sort of protectionist instincts that the crisis has aroused are going to lead to even more problems in the very near future. And I think the UK needs to be a flag bearer for the principle of free trade, because we've been used for decades to rallying behind the US as the champion of free trade, and we can no longer rely on the US to make that argument in international fora.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you. And moving on now to Harriet, please.
Thank you, Mel. And I'm going to start by asking Philip a question, as you were the most recent in post, and move on to monetary policy. And there are some that are arguing that de facto the Bank of England is engaging in monetary financing at the moment. Do you think that there are any significant concerns about the bank's monetary independence at the moment? I
don't see concerns about the independence of the Bank of England. As you know, the Bank of England is fiercely protective of its independence. But it's also, and this is a delicate balancing act, because fiscal and monetary policy interact as they do, there clearly has to be a sensible level of coordination between chancellors and governors of the Bank of England. I don't think that compromises independence, but it's clearly important that we don't have monetary and fiscal policy pulling in opposite directions, as, for example, arguably, within the last few years we've seen in the US. If we're trying to deal with a problem, we need to be using fiscal and monetary policy tools in a way which is complementary. But no, I don't have a fear about Bank of England independence.
And one for Alistair then, please, in terms of the Ways and Means facility, which I know you had to use during the financial crisis. Do you have any issues or concerns about the Treasury using the Ways and Means facility this year?
Not at the moment, no. I should explain that normally, if the government wants to borrow money, it will do it by issuing bonds, and it does that through the very efficient Debt Management Office. But you can't do that overnight. You need money short term, you need to get it, and that's what you use your central bank for. Now, as long as you repay it, within a reasonable time, then it's discharging the function that it was. It's what we did, at 10 years ago. Where it becomes a problem if you've got a country that simply effectively prints money for you, because in the long term that will have a detrimental effect. But I'm not concerned about it just now. It seems a very sensible thing to do because the government will have to spend money at short notice, and it obviously needs to get it. And like Philip, I'm not concerned about the perception of the Bank of England's independence, although I would say that one of the bank's statutory duties is to support the government's economic policy. So, that's been there since we made it independent in 1998. But using the Ways and Means facility is perfectly sensible, as long as and both the government and the bank have said they expect this to be temporary.
Thank you. And one for George. We heard from the Bank of England at the last session that they would, if they felt they needed to target their inflation target, allow or be there when an auction failed, that it wasn't their responsibility to stop an auction failing. Do you think in reality that the government would allow that level of independence from the bank in the real world with debt over 100% of GDP?
Well, I think, I'm with my colleagues, former colleagues, and that, I don't think there's anything to particularly worry about at the moment. And in many ways, British sort of central banking independence has grown up. When the bank was made independent by Alistair's government, understandably, the bank wanted to really prove it was independent. And was, had a very sort of formal relationship with the Treasury and with chancellors. And then with recent governors, that has become more informal. I saw that happen in my own relationship with Mervyn King, and then, of course, with Mark Carney, and now you have, the very excellent Andrew Bailey. As the bank itself has got more confident about its independence, it hasn't had to kind of stand on ceremony. And I think that's very healthy. I think the kind of one question, which your sort of question it sort of implies, which is what happens when a government starts to depend on the central bank as its sort of source of financing, not as an emergency, not as quantitative easing in the last 10 years, which Alistair started and I continued, or what the bank's doing now around yield curve control. But what happens, let's imagine, fast forward a world 3 or 4 years' time where, there's no attempt to kind of bring the public finances back into order. There's just an assumption by whoever's the government that the bank will always be buying its debt, so it doesn't have to worry really about its kind of international credibility and whether its bond auctions fail or succeed. I think that's where you potentially get a risk, and this is not by any means something specific to this country. I think we've got more credible institutions here than others. But you know, central banking is changing, and we're moving away from a world of kind of, you know, the sort of academic institution on the hill that set the inflation target, and that was it, into a world where it was already in, because of the financial crisis, deeply enmeshed in the banking system. Now enmeshed in the financing of many governments in the West, and you know, I think kind of institutions, protocols, parliamentary scrutiny will have to change to catch up and keep the pace with it.
Can I cast your mind back then to when you changed the remit for the bank back in 2013, and you made it easier for them to temporarily prioritize growth over inflation in exceptional circumstances? And clearly, I think everyone would agree we're in exceptional circumstances at the moment. Can you recall if that change was initiated by the bank at the time?
Well, I think it came out of from memory. I'm happy, you know, if my memory's failed me to write later. But it came out of a discussion after a period of quite high inflation. In fact, one of the toughest times I had as Chancellor, which is just a reminder of a world we thought we'd left behind a very long time ago, a world of inflation. My toughest years as Chancellor was when inflation rocketed, driven by a very high increase in the oil price. And you know, the bank, I think quite sensibly at the time, and this was their independent judgment of the MPC, looked through the inflation target and didn't raise rates at a time when obviously that would have been terrible for an economy just coming out of the financial crash. And the remit was partly, you know, a reflection of what was already happening, and was also partly a reflection from memory that the bank was taking on responsibilities for the financial system. And obviously, you know, I wanted to make sure that in the regulation of the financial system, obviously one way to regulate financial systems that never fails is not to have one. But you also had to have a financial system that was providing credit into the economy, as the way we've just discussed in this session. And that had to be bottom line.
Sounds as though that was probably initiated by you, former Chancellor, but I appreciate if you can follow up with a letter. But I want to just move on to Alistair and ask him one, because his perspective is the longest ago in post. That do you think that we've now got institutions that are robust enough that there would be an outcry that would, if a future Chancellor were to change the Bank of England's inflation target for politically expedient reasons?
Well, yeah, it depends on the circumstances, and you know, when you're talking about because you know, I think all three of us have said we've all had to deal with different economic circumstances, and you know, at some point in the future, you know, there's always been a debate about whether you know the central bank should be targeting growth as opposed to inflation. And you know, naturally, when inflation's at rock bottom, then you know, that's a live debate. But I think the independence of the central bank is important.
Well, again, then on that, if they were to, because you heard what the governor said at the last session about not ruling out negative rates. So, you know, if you were Chancellor and negative rates were on the table, is that something that you would see them engaging with the Chancellor on, or would that be something that they would do completely independent of government?
Well, the bank has the power to fix rates, but I think it's inconceivable that Andrew Bailey and the Chancellor wouldn't sit down to discuss the implications of that.
And so, if they did it, would you support it?
Well, I have some difficulty in that I'm just wondering what the effect would be on banks. And then the political problem you've got, are you going to exempt savers from, you know, the pensioner who's got some money in the bank? Are they going to have a negative rate?
So that doesn't sound like a strong support for it. Philip, would you support it?
I think this must be a decision for the Bank of England. And as a Chancellor in office, you've got to be very careful to protect the independence of the Bank of England, and commenting on monetary policy decisions, implicitly criticising or supporting a decision of the Bank of England isn't appropriate. I mean, I hope I did this. I always intended to be strictly neutral, and when the bank made a pronouncement of any kind in its area of responsibility, simply to note that this is an area for the bank to make decisions within the remit that the government has given it.
Sorry to have to crack through the questions so fast, but I'm out of time as well.
Thank you, Harriet, and thanks for your understanding. Can I go to Alison now, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got some questions in the area I think you all were hoping to avoid, and I wanted to ask a little bit about Brexit and the impact that coronavirus is going to have on that. So firstly, I'd like to ask Philip Hammond about the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on the cost of the EU leaving the UK leaving the EU transition period without a deal relative to the status quo because of the impact of the way that trade flows. Any further comments on that?
Well, I mean, it's no secret that I've always been a strong advocate of the UK having the closest possible trade relationship with the European Union. That isn't out of any kind of sentimentality. It's out of an observation that, for better or for worse, over 45 years, our economy has shaped itself around a close trading relationship with the European Union and complex interconnected supply chains. And my observation would be that in the second half of this year, hopefully, the UK economy is going to be recovering from an extremely painful economic shock. And in that, we're going to have that in common with many of our competitor economies. To place ourselves at a disadvantage by then having a second shock later this year would not be helpful. So I'm very supportive of the government's stated objective of getting a good trade deal done with the European Union. But I think there are some real challenges, some practical challenges around bandwidth and around the inability to travel. And I do wonder whether it might be possible for the government to agree at least a temporary trade deal with the European Union, which is perhaps not satisfactory to them in the long term, but something that would allow us at least more time to negotiate the full-scale trade deal, and respecting the fact that the government's made a clear political decision that it is not prepared to extend the transition. There has to be a way of avoiding placing an additional challenge for the recovering UK economy later this year.
So would it be your feeling that the UK doesn't have the capacity at the moment to negotiate that trade deal, to do all the things that it needs to do before the end of the year?
Well, I don't think it's just the UK. I think that obviously the government here has as its number one priority managing the coronavirus crisis. Governments across Europe are in the same place. The EU itself is facing quite a lot of internal challenges, partly as a result of the coronavirus crisis, partly as a result of the German Constitutional Court. This is not the ideal environment to be trying to reach a long-term deal that will shape the relationship between the UK and its most important trading partner for decades to come. And if there was a way of doing something which is quick and dirty, as it were, a simple arrangement, which may not suit either party as a long-term settlement, but which is an acceptable temporary stopgap, that may be the best way forward.
Do you think it would be simpler to extend the transition period?
Well, the government's ruled that out as a matter of policy. And rather than sort of bang on a closed door, I would rather suggest another way forward. If it is not possible to get an all singing, all dancing deal done over the next few months, I would urge the government to think about some kind of interim trade deal, which at least avoids a second shock to the economy later this year.
Okay, thank you. And what do you feel the kind of best outcome for the financial sector would be post-Brexit?
Well, I think in the best realistic outcome is going to be an expanded equivalence regime. And I think that it is possible to negotiate such an arrangement, but it will only be possible in the context of a broader deal that feels like something that works for both sides. I think if we're looking at a minimalist trade deal in general terms, it will be very difficult to then get a financial services deal, which really underpins and protects our financial services industry's trade with the European Union.
Okay, and if I could expand this out to Mr. Osborne as well. Scenarios were produced about the impact of the UK leaving the EU. All of these kind of scenarios are now kind of drowned out by the impact of coronavirus. Do you think it's important that the government knows the impact of the UK leaving the EU in these circumstances?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, there was, I produced, when I was Chancellor, and it was pretty controversial at the time because it was before the referendum, some forecasts, including a medium-term forecast of the impact on the UK of leaving the EU and what would happen with different types of future arrangements, like a free trade deal or EFTA or whatever. And, I couldn't help but notice a couple of years later when a government now committed to Brexit produced a similar kind of analysis that came up with a very similar result. And indeed, that everyone who's looked internationally at the British economy has come to the conclusion, that we've already lost, I think it's around 2.5% GDP over what we would have had if we hadn't taken the choice we had. But we've made that choice. But there's no point not commissioning the analysis. You can commission the analysis, and by the way, choose for very good other reasons. Maybe you want to take back control of parliamentary sovereignty, for example, and you want to weigh that against the economic costs. Those are perfectly reasonable things to do, but at least I might not support them, but they're reasonable sort of political judgments, but do it with the analysis in front of you.
Okay. And would you think that an extension to the transitions period or some other thing is wise, sensible in the circumstances?
Well, I tell you what I think is going to happen, which is, I don't know if that answers your question. I think they'll have a deal, but it'll just be a deal to go on dealing. It'll, both sides, neither side wants to go off a cliff, not least because of what's happened with COVID. But equally, both sides have revealed, including this current British government and current British Prime Minister, that they don't want to take the economy off a cliff. And this was pre the recession we're now in. And so I think we'll end up with something that is called a trade agreement by the end of the year, but it's actually just an agreement to go on talking about this sector and that sector and whatever. And so I'm more optimistic, I think, than quite a few people that we'll avoid that cliff edge.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, to Alistair Darling, there's a new study from the Scottish Government out today that says without an extension, Scottish GDP could be up to 1.1% lower after 2 years. And I wonder what your thoughts would be about an extension or a deal, or what the government would do if you were in charge of this scenario.
Look, I largely agree with what George and Philip have said. My view. I think it was a profound mistake, but I accept the result of the referendum, and we just have to move on from there. I think a no deal would be absolutely disastrous. With everything we're going through with COVID, you'd have to be mad to want to end up in the situation where you erect huge trade barriers and tariffs just at the time when you're hoping your economy might be beginning to recover. Certainly my experience with the EU is that if you can get some sort of deal that's acceptable, they would do it. And George Osborne's suggestion there that perhaps the deal will be a deal to carry on talking, can't be ruled out. But then I can't get into the mind of the Prime Minister, so I have no idea where he's going to end up. I can't believe that he actually wants to take the risk, because people will notice it. And as for the loss to GDP, yes, as you know, there's lots of estimates there. Of course, it'll have an effect, and the whole UK is in Scotland included. But if they can reach a good deal, good and well. But my guess is it will one of these. So you see, I've lived through a lot of them in my time when I dealt with the European Union. It'll be a sort of deal that everybody will say, isn't this great? But it means you're coming back to the table the next week to carry on talking. However, talking is better than breaking off relations.
Yes, and you said earlier about sort of international cooperation being particularly important. And do you think that the coronavirus will also have an impact on the trade deals potentially that the UK could make during this time period?
I'm not so sure about that, because international trade deals tend to take years to put together. The frequently cited example is the one that we've got with Canada at the moment, which took the best part of 7 years to negotiate. So, hopefully the virus will be, under control long before then. No, I think the biggest agreement with trade deals is that, the countries will look at us and say they need to do a deal, and we'll take as long as it takes. but on the other hand, you may see, for the United States, for example, you may see one of these breakthrough deals that isn't quite what it seems, but you live to fight another day. But I don't think the virus will affect them so much. I think we should look at the virus will have an economic effect on us. And I think the fact that we have broken a big trade deal and are seeking to replace it with an awful lot of others, with an awful lot of discussions to take place, is going to take some time, and it will cause harm to us. Naturally, in the near term, as nobody can fly to meet anyone else, and despite the wonders of Zoom, I don't think they're great for negotiating trade deals.
Okay, thank you
very much.
And thank you, Alison. Over to Steve, please.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming. It's a real privilege to have you here. I'd like to take advantage of your considerable expertise by asking you about machinery of government and how some of these decisions are taken as we go through recovering from this COVID crisis. So can I ask you, how important do you think it is that the Treasury maintains a degree of independence from number 10? Perhaps I might come to Alistair Darling first.
Yeah, I think we got a broader point. Yes, I do think that the Treasury and the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, there's two separate functions there. Remember, the Prime Minister is the first amongst equals. It's not a presidential system, and I understand. I've worked with two Prime Ministers. The frustration that they sometimes have that actually the number 10 office is very small. Now, the Cabinet Office is really, a place, it's a gather-up place for lots of other functions in the government. And they sometimes feel, well, we don't know what's going on in the Treasury or in other places as well. But at the end of the day, if the Chancellor doesn't like what's going on in the Treasury, he's got the ultimate power to hire and fire. But the idea that you can have the Chancellor of the Exchequer as a sort of, almost the equivalent of a paid-up civil servant just to do what number 10 wants. That's not how our constitution works, and it shouldn't be tried to work that way. Ministers are accountable to Parliament. I think all governments are healthier if there is constructive tension there, robust discussions between colleagues. It reflects well on the Prime Minister, but you can't. This is not a presidential system. And all these analogies to what's happened, how other governments work, I think are wholly inappropriate. The other thing that's relatively unusual, actually, and I'm sure George and Philip will notice this, that many finance ministers in Europe are not elected. They are there to serve the Prime Minister. I know one of them asking me, how can you take decisions if you've got to think of the voters? And I would say, well, how on earth can you take decisions if you don't?
Well, thank you very much. I must just press you before I come to George Osborne on the characterisation that you use there. I mean, are you really suggesting that the present Chancellor is there, as I think you said, was a paid-up civil servant to do the bidding of number 10? Does that seem to be the implication of what you said?
No, I was not saying that. And, for the avoidance of doubt, I think that the present Chancellor has been doing a very good job in the time that he's been appointed. I suppose my remarks were more prompted by the events of last week, where you've got a special advisor, because that's all he is to the Prime Minister. At least that's what he's supposed to be, all he is to the Prime Minister. This idea that all the other special advisors, including the ones in the Treasury, would be subservient to him. And that's really what I was getting at.
Great, well that's a relief, because I think the present Chancellor is doing a fantastic job too. George, could I turn to you? And you had a famously close relationship with David Cameron. Could I ask you, what is your reflection on the need for a degree of independence at the Treasury?
Yeah, I think it's good to see you, Steve.
You too.
I think Prime Ministers are stronger themselves when they're more comfortable with a semi-independent Treasury and a strong Chancellor alongside them. I think of the sort of Margaret Thatcher at her best was when she had a pretty independent-minded Nigel Lawson doing a lot of the great sort of Thatcher reforms. I think, the most successful period of the Blair government was when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were working well together in those first few years. And, and I think the Cameron government, well, you'd have to ask him, but, I think, he was able to do the things he wanted to because he knew he was the First Lord of the Treasury, but he didn't have to constantly prove it because he knew he had a Chancellor who respected that, but was also getting on and delivering on the agenda. And I think Prime Ministers who are anti-Treasury come a cropper, not that I can think of anyone recently.
Would you have accepted a common pool of advisors when you were Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Well, I mean, I thought Sajid Javid was placed in an impossible situation, frankly. And as far as I can see, it was sort of no one expected him to resign, and it was a big cock up. I think some of my my advisors were actually also advisors to the Prime Minister, and that's when it really works well. So it's now you want that a bit of tension, and look, ultimately the Treasury is often the sort of the department in the room that has to say no. It has to say, unfortunately, we can't afford that, and sometimes that's as a sort of lonely function. And sometimes the Prime Minister's job is to overrule the Chancellor. I think Chancellors also need to accept that they are, at a point, part of a team. And sometimes there's a broader judgment for the government that actually we do need to spend this money, or this, audacious tax rise that the Chancellor's proposed is going to, hold the government below the waterline, or, indeed, chancellors should also pay close attention to their chief whips as well. So I think that it's sort of everyone understanding their role in the system, and obviously politics is also about personality. It doesn't always work out like that. But I think actually Rishi Sunak is manoeuvring what is, let's be honest, quite a complicated situation and relationship by just getting on and doing the job well, and coming up with the ideas.
Thank you very much. Philip, you were nodding along in agreement at the idea of the lonely task of the Treasury to say no. Would you like to elaborate on that point? And I in particular, I'm wondering whether the Treasury might have lost something on that point by becoming a bit closer to number 10.
Yeah, so I agree with what George has said, and I agree with Alistair's point that there needs to be some tension between number 10 and number 11. A Prime Minister doesn't need a bunch of yes men around him, or yes women. What he needs are people who will challenge him, put the counter arguments. But as George said, and George has said many times to me when he was Chancellor, you do all this, never forgetting who is actually the boss. And in the end, once you've said your bit, you've presented your arguments, you've made your case, if you are overruled by the Prime Minister, then the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister's view prevails. But if number 10 and number 11 are too close together, then it will not be possible for the Chancellor to even make those coherent arguments. And Prime Ministers and Chancellors come at issues from different perspectives. Prime Ministers are often very focused on the public view of the government and the delivery of overall strategic objectives. Chancellors are often focused on some of the warning bells that will be ringing in their own cellar. So I do think that keeping enough distance to be able to provide strong independent advice, and then acquiescing if, having done it, you are overruled, is the right relationship between Prime Minister and Chancellor. I'll just say one other thing, Steve, that Alistair mentioned the very small size of the Prime Minister's office at the centre of government. And I think all Prime Ministers look at the Treasury as part of the centre of government and see disproportionate muscle, too many people in the Treasury compared to the number of people in the Prime Minister's office, Cabinet Office team. And that sometimes provokes a reaction. But the Treasury is a tool to be used by the centre of government in delivering the policy objectives and doing them in a sustainable way.
Well, I'm down to my last question, I think, in order to finish. Could I ask you all, would you have tweeted support for the Prime Minister's chief advisor when he was in the difficulty he was in? Was that something that surprised you, or could you imagine yourselves doing it as Chancellor? Perhaps I could start with Alistair, since you're most distant from this.
Well, I'm all right, because I certainly wouldn't have been sending a tweet. And I think, apart from a few short months on the Scottish referendum campaign, I have never knowingly tweeted.
Never knowingly tweeted. George, you tweet. I've seen you. I follow you. You follow me. We've occasionally perhaps needled each other. Would you have tweeted support for Rishi? As Rishi did.
We had some success helping Rob Halfon vote in the last 24 hours, thanks to Twitter. The thing about I would have said it's a bloody stupid idea to get us all to tweet, because it's just going to reveal what a crisis we've got in the middle of the government. You know, and if you all issue suddenly all these tweets about the Prime Minister's special advisor, it tells you one thing, which is the special advisor's clinging on.
Since we're running out of time, Philip, I won't put you on the spot unless you want to leap in. Otherwise,
well, I'll just say one thing. When I see lots of tweets from ministers that all say the same thing, I can easily envisage that there was an earlier tweet from the Chief Whip suggesting how ministers might want to tweet.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you very much, all of you. It's been a pleasure, and I very much appreciate it. And we've all finished smiling, so that's a good forward step.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. And finally, going to Mike, please. Mike, I think you need to unmute yourself.
There you go. There you go. Thanks everybody for coming. It's been an interesting session for me. I'd like to touch on the future prospects for the UK. The COVID crisis has thrown up a lot of conundrums. Rushinara touched on child poverty. There's issues of mental health and stress. There's environmental issues. George, you said there's a real apartheid in this country around education and access to equipment. All of that is in the mix. And some countries, in particular Iceland that we've been looking at, and New Zealand have begun to develop, and Scotland as well, have begun to develop well-being budgets to incorporate well-being as well as economic growth. So I'd just like to ask the general question, please, and starting with Philip, if that's okay. Given the focus on mortality rates because of COVID, is it time for the Treasury now to focus on a wider set of measures of welfare rather than just economic growth? And if so, would it be difficult to wean the Treasury off traditional measures of economic growth, and how can that be done?
Well, I don't think that the Treasury only looks at economic growth. But it's interesting you mentioned Iceland and New Zealand, both countries with significantly higher GDP per capita than we have in the UK. And obviously, continuing to grow your GDP per capita ad infinitum is perhaps not in everybody's interest or anybody's interest. But there will be an awful lot of people in this country who feel that at present levels of income, they need this economy to be growing. They need to see a path to raising their earnings, their standards of living, to seeing their children having better prospects than they have. It is a luxury that we should definitely aspire to, but I fear we may not be there yet, to be able to be willing to sacrifice some economic growth in order to achieve some other goods. But I would be wary of letting the system off, as it were, being accountable for delivering on the objective that we've set it. And for me, I'm sorry to be repetitive, but at the very end of this session, the clear objective of the Treasury and the economic part of government, for me, should be to raise productivity so that we have rising living standards in this country.
What about Alistair? What's your opinion?
Well, firstly, don't knock growth, not least because we haven't got much of it at the moment. In fact, there's a distinct lack of it. And when it comes to people's well-being, how much they get paid, the fact whether in a job or not, the availability of public services and so on, they add to your general well-being, which is really, I suppose, the bigger point that I've seen examples of countries setting up a well-being fund, and it's a bit right. A few years ago, someone advocated we should have a happiness index. I was just wondering how on earth you could construct an index where everybody was happy, and whatever was in it, everybody thought was a good thing. And I think the other thing that I would say to Mike is that I spent 13 years in the cabinet, and frankly, I would rather the government concentrated on a few things that it did well than starting to go into areas where I'm far from convinced it would actually make a difference. And you know, the more general aim, the less likely you are to deliver it, I think.
So, George, you were behind a Northern Powerhouse. My constituency is part of that, particle and part of the green technology agenda, which I think is very exciting. And we've got to develop we've got some social responsibility, haven't we? What's your opinions on this?
Yeah, I think, well, actually, we did introduce a general well-being index. And I think it came from Bhutan, was the original idea. And I think the ONS does produce it. And I actually think it's not sort of airy-fairy as it sounds. It's actually quite a good guide also to how people feel in the country, whether they're optimistic about the future. And I think the Treasury and the rest of government very regularly, indeed almost always will sometimes trump economic efficiency with some broader social goal. It'll redirect resources around the country to poorer areas. It'll help poorer, more disadvantaged people. This pandemic is a great example of not putting sort of GDP first, if you like. So I think governments exist, but to often, take those decisions to intervene in markets and avoid the outcomes that a pure free market, if ever such a thing could be constructed. I'm not sure you would ever have a free market without a government setting the rules of the game anyway. But in theory, that a government that a sort of untrammeled free market would deliver. So, I think we already have that kind of thing. Maybe we're not as good as Iceland, Bhutan, or New Zealand at it. But there we go.
I've not been in New Zealand. I've been to Iceland. It's beautiful. So my next question would, in reverse. So George, again, what will be the key challenges for nations where low rates of productivity and economic growth are the norm?
Well, the biggest one, I mean, Philip's been quite rightly repeatedly telling us about this productivity. It's such a boring word. I remember, the chamber got to fall asleep when in one of my budgets I got onto the productivity section. But it's incredibly important because it drives improvements in living standards, which are ultimately, as Alistair was saying, an important component of many people's happiness. So that kind of pushing back, trying to find ways to make our economies more productive seems to me the sort of central task and challenge ahead.
Okay, thank you. Alistair, so Alistair, during the lockdown, there was an increase in remote working and the country